quite a few comments from my last video that were asked repeatedly by multiple people. I got so tired of typing out the same answers over and over again, so I figured I'd make a video addressing them. To be fair, a lot of the comments derived from parts of my video where I hadn't made myself entirely clear, or I'd left some points ambiguous. First off, I'll make a quick reply to Integral Math, or the Just a Car, who made a video response to me about my statements regarding law enforcement. You should subscribe to him because I said so, and obviously anyone who subscribes to me will do whatever I say. At any rate, my statements were about Indian law enforcement, which was in reference to the AIB 365 video that Thunderfoot was addressing. Last year there were protests in New Delhi over the authorities' mediocre handling of rape cases, which included outright victim blaming. While we're on the subject, this sort of thing has happened in the States from time to time, although admittedly much of the accounts are anecdotal. Police forces in larger metropolitan areas are more likely to have the manpower and the funds to properly investigate such cases and bring perpetrators to justice. But in other places like small-town bumblefuck New Kansas-Tuckioma, local authorities may be fewer in numbers, fewer in state funding, and less trained to handle rape cases. Or maybe just flat out don't care. Since my last video, Melinda Coleman has gone public about her then 14-year-old daughter having been incapacitated and raped by the 17-year-old grandson of a former Missouri state representative, an assault that was filmed by a witness who later circulated the video. She was later dumped on her own doorstep, wet and still passed out in below freezing temperatures. Not only were the charges dropped in this case, but the Coleman family was then harassed by other residents in Maryville, Missouri, so relentlessly that they moved away 7 months later. Their old house was later torched. This story has just made the headlines, and I'm sure that not all the details are public yet, but how many times has something similar occurred? The Steubenville case, which included much harassment toward the victim who had been unconscious during the attack, concluded with the rapists being sentenced to just 1 or 2 years in prison. 16-year-old Rehtaeh Parsons from Nova Scotia, Canada, committed suicide after no charges were filed after she was gang raped, bullied, and a photo of her attack was circulated online. 14-year-old Charisse Morales of Montana committed suicide after being raped by her teacher, who was subsequently sentenced to just 30 days in prison. And these are just the accounts that were publicized. Overall, they probably make up a very small percentage of rape cases that actually are prosecuted, but the fact that they happen at all means that a lot of districts have justice systems that are failing their people. Moving on, a lot of people accuse me of strawmanning Thunderfoot's assessment regarding date rape. What concerns me most is this specific sentence.
Someone drugs you or similar, well, that's a whole different story. But you are responsible for your actions, even if you choose to get drunk first.
Even if you choose to get drunk first. And then he caps it off by claiming that it's not victim blaming, but how is it not? You are responsible for your actions, even if you choose to get drunk first. Makes a very clear statement. You chose to get blind stinking drunk, and that's why you were raped. Full stop. The most common response was that Thunderfoot wasn't talking about rape, he was talking about consensual sex. That would have been all well and good, except that he wasn't talking about consensual sex. And that is the conclusion that I drew from his scenario.
This then bleeds into the weakest claims of rape, which are of the ilk that, sure, I chose of my own volition to get drunk off my face, full in the knowledge that such intoxication in a public place was going to make me more gregarious. And sure, I fully consented at the time. But in the hard light of the morning after the night before, I decided that I wouldn't have done it if I was sober. Therefore, it was not consensual. Therefore, it was rape.
If you recall from my previous video, I rejected the notion that all drunk sex is rape. But in this scenario, Thunderfoot didn't say that the person was merely drunk. He said, drunk off my face. Now granted, that is not a technical term. Who knows what he meant by that? Well, actually, we all do, because he used numerous images to illustrate precisely the levels of intoxication that he had in mind. He used images of women who were too drunk to walk on their own, one that gave the impression that she had either just vomited or was about to, and another image of someone who appears to be unconscious. These images indicate levels of intoxication in which the subjects had lost a substantial amount of control over their own motor functions and were even physically ill, essentially making them helpless to an extent, especially to a sex act. In addition, take into consideration the effects of alcohol has on the brain and how it manifests physical and mental impairments at the same time. People with this level of intoxication can black out or not be fully aware of what's going on around them. Now, the law doesn't draw an arbitrary line when it comes to drunk sex and rape in the same way it does when it comes to driving under the influence, for example. But displaying outward signs of such extreme inebriation suggests that a person's ability to give valid consent is severely compromised, to say the least. What alarms me is that not only did Thunderfoot ignore all of this and simply write off the scenario as just a case of regret sex, but a lot of people seem to agree with him. I have to ask, what kind of a person could see another person in such a weakened, vulnerable condition and even think about having sex with that person? It's opportunistic and sociopathic. Furthermore, I see a disturbing hypocrisy to allow for a reprieve only when he or she has been drugged against his or her will. Given that, it would have to include alcohol as well, because that too is a drug. Keeping in mind how alcohol affects the brain, why should it matter if someone willingly drinks to excess or knowingly consumes a drug that can possibly cause incapacitation, as opposed to someone else tricking that person or forcing it to be consumed? It's not like it's going to make a difference in how that drug will affect that person, depending on the amount that is consumed. Either way, that person will be left in no condition to make choices about sex. I wouldn't trust a person that drunk to choose where to go for dinner. I think it's safe to assume that we've all seen people in this condition, or some of us have been in this condition. If a person is not even steady enough to tie his or her own shoes, or conscious, how can anyone rightly presume that the ability to give valid consent is still intact? Another comment that showed up a lot was the classification of sex between two very drunk people. Is that rape? By definition, two people cannot mutually rape each other. Rape is sex without consent, so it's just not possible. When it comes to gray areas like this, I'll admit, they're not that easy to call. On one hand, it calls into question of who was likely to have had more control, and just how likely it is for two people to be equally drunk. Obviously, if one of the parties was incapacitated, then it's pretty much a no-brainer. If not, then theoretically, either individual could be accused of rape, but that would be very hard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. There's just no easy answer to such a scenario, and as with all cases, it would have to be judged individually. But the only comment that I was annoyed with is the insistence of comparing sex while drunk to driving under the influence, with the excuse that we hold people who are drunk or high behind the wheel accountable for their actions. Yes, but it's an invalid comparison. A car is not another person. It cannot be complicit in a crime. It cannot be held responsible for its own actions because it has none of its own. It cannot force you to drive it. Driving is an autonomous act, so it is judged differently from sex, which, with another person, is dependent on the actions of at least one other individual. And when it comes to sex with someone whose ability to consent is questionable, whether that be a minor, or someone with an extreme mental illness or defect, or someone who is extremely drunk, the other person's actions and intent are, to put it lightly, suspicious and most likely criminal. And at this point, I'm going to remind you all for the third time that I reject the notion that all drunk sex is rape. So I hope that clears a few things up. In addition, I suggest that you check out Noel Plum 99's videos on the topic. He offers a lot of good insight. I'll also link to Concordant's recent videos as well. I'd also like to mention that the user The Barking Atheist, or Daniel Moran, as his friends like to call him, is running for Texas State Representative as a Democrat. Please give him a like on Facebook. The link, as with everything else I've referenced, is in the description box. Other than that, have a great week, and if you don't see my mug before the 31st, have an awesome Halloween.